As we gather here today, we acknowledge that the Greater Milwaukee Foundation offices reside on the traditional homelands and waterways of Native people including the Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Potawatomi, and Kickapoo. They were forcibly removed from their homes and forced to assimilate. Their relationship with the land and surrounding water predates ours and will extend far beyond our own. We offer our respect to the knowledge, culture, and wealth that white supremacy destroyed.
We acknowledge that this country was built upon the labor of black and brown people who were stolen and enslaved. We offer our respect to all black lives and the knowledge, culture, and wealth that white supremacy destroyed.
We recognize our duty and commitment to build a beloved community where equity and social justice prevail. We acknowledge the work that has been done and the work to come to achieve this.
What I envision for Milwaukee is a place of unity and togetherness. I feel like we don't collaborate much as a city. I feel like we don't collaborate much together. And once we take those proper steps, we'll start actually seeing real change. My advice would be to connect with the people who are actually directly involved. You need to work with those grassroots organizations. You need to work with the people who actually are affected by the issues on the day-to-day, so you can understand and know exactly where to take the first steps, at least. Once you're able to collaborate with others and once you're able to combine with others, that's when you'll first start to see the changes. It takes those sit downs and those meetings, in that brainstorming, what can we do differently, what's working here, what's not working here, for us to really understand our differences, but also our similarities. And I think that's what will make us better in the long run. I feel like that's how we'll achieve our vision.
Thank you, Sevion. You've helped set the tone for why we're here today and why we value youth voice and community voice so much in our work. I'm Ellen Gilligan, President and CEO of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. Welcome to this year's final A Milwaukee for All event. Today, our focus is community philanthropy, leading from lived experience. And I have the pleasure of opening this program with Tanya Allen, President of the McKnight Foundation. Together, we'll discuss the importance of including underrepresented voices in philanthropic conversations and decisions. We'll consider the role of community narratives in racial equity, as well as the opportunity to take change to a greater scale. After our dialogue, Tanya and I will join a roundtable discussion where several local leaders will share their perspectives and explain how community voice is central to the work. Following the formal program, I encourage everyone to stay online for a live, virtual talkback session. We look forward to hearing your ideas and strategies for helping create a Milwaukee for all. But first of all, allow me to introduce my friend and colleague, our special guest, Tanya Allen. Tanya Allen is a national leader on philanthropic diversity, inclusion, and equity practices. She is known as a change agent with a passion for co-creating an equitable, sustainable world. Before joining the Minneapolis-based McKnight Foundation in 2021, she was president and CEO of the Skillman Foundation, a children's philanthropy in Detroit. Her career has been forged by a variety of roles, from community organizer to civic leader to author. I have known Tanya and watched her and admired her from afar. Our paths have crossed in her role at the Council on Foundations and mine at CF Leads. And we have many mutual friends in philanthropy in Minneapolis and Detroit. So I am so pleased that Tanya has chosen to spend her morning with us today. Welcome, Tanya.
Hi, Ellen. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be with you. I wish I was in Milwaukee, but I'm happy to be calling in from Minneapolis.
Well, we thank you so much, Tanya, and we look forward to you visiting Milwaukee. We have lots to show you and lots to share because much of our work is so aligned. So we'll look forward to that visit in person.
Wonderful.
So let's start by talking about the importance of focusing on a community's inherent value. Far too often, communities in our cities and states are defined by their deficits rather than their contributions and potential. And as you advance the work of a foundation that's focused on racial equity, much like our work in the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, how have you successfully framed important issues around a community's assets? And what challenges have you faced while doing so?
Thank you. Well, I think that's a really important question. And before I start, I do just want to say how much I admire you, Ellen, and all of the meaningful work that you're doing in Milwaukee. So I just wanted to send you a little love before I got started on that question. So I think one of the things that I really value deeply about community philanthropy is that community philanthropy really allows us the privilege of bringing people together to co-create and to create the architecture for change while we're trying to purposely disrupt the status quo and seek to unravel and rebuild systems that have stymied racial justice for a really long time. And so I just want to give you a little bit of background on the way that I think about this work as I get to this question about like, how do we shift and how do we change narratives and how do we serve as asset-based kind of ambassadors for a place. So this is the way that I think is that about philanthropy and about change in communities. So I use this concept that I often refer to as radical love. And so as people who work in philanthropy, we all know that the root word of philanthropy is the love of people. And so I often think about philanthropy as a loving behavior, a loving act of how we show up in community to meet people's needs because we deeply love them. And so when I think about what it means to meet someone's needs, it means that we're not just going to deal with the surface issues, right? Like I think about like an iceberg and you think about like what you see is visible. And sometimes we like to serve and deal with the things that are visible versus going to the root of an issue, which is below the water, below the surface, and really understanding what those challenges are and trying to address those. And that's where I get this notion of radical at, because radical, the root word of radical is radix, which means to get to the root of something, right? So if you are demonstrating love and that love says, I'm going to get to the root of a problem to fundamentally rechange and restructure the system in which you're operating, then what you're operating in is what I believe is community philanthropy, that this notion of executing and delivering radical love. So when I think about this question, I often think that what we have when we talk about people and talk about places, we're often talking about their deficits, right? Like I recall after George Floyd's death, we spent a lot of time, people talked about the deficits, the challenges of Black people in this country. And in no way am I saying we should ignore the deficits or the challenges. What I would say is we can't define people by their deficits and their challenges. Let's talk about what does aspirations look like? What are the aspirations of Black communities? What are the aspirations of Black families? Now, when you start talking about aspiration, you're thinking about how do you build a future that looks different, that creates opportunity, and that allows people to thrive, versus how do you look at an old system, old structure of something that's broken, that has never worked for folks, but you're trying to figure out how to fix it, right? Like, so it's the difference between being builders of the future and people who are trying to figure out how to fix the past. And so when I think about asset framing, it's really about creating this and architecting a future that allows people to see what the possibilities are and creating pathways to get there. When I worked in Detroit, one of the things that we would often talk about, and I know you do this work in Milwaukee, which is really about how do you create opportunities for young people to thrive. And so in Detroit, and this is not just a Detroit issue, this is an issue in Milwaukee, it's an issue in Minneapolis, it's all across from coast to coast. We talk about what does it take to help kids beat the odds versus actually that's the wrong framing, right? Like we don't want children to be, their success to be an anomaly, like that they have to figure out how to tackle these barriers of racism, lack of funding, all these kind of challenges that sit in front of them. And then we just assume that if they do that, then like we've been successful. Well, actually, if you have to beat the odds, then you actually have the wrong system in play. What we should be thinking about is how do we change the odds? So what does the odds look like when actually you think about it like my system is going to be in place and you almost have to, it's almost fail proof, right? Like that I believe every child that comes through this system is going to be so successful that they have to do something crazy to fall through the cracks. Like they have to do something that is an anomaly that would allow them to fall through the cracks. That's when you've actually restructured the odds so that everyone can be successful. And I'll give you one quick example of that. Is I was once having a conversation with a group of universities, and we were basically talking about what does it take to get young people into college and to have that first successful year where they're really thriving. And so we were having this conversation about what does it look like to prep them for ACTs and SATs, and what does scholarships look like, and how might they make their application to college? And I think those are all of the kinds of things that we would traditionally think about. And my challenge to them at that point, and to myself, honestly, in that conversation was like, what does it look like if we automatically guarantee that every child, we just tell them, you are going to go to college, and we're going to figure out how to make sure that in that first year, you don't have to pay anything. And that we're going to put the supports around you versus trying to make them jump through hoops and go through the same practices and processes that haven't worked for them. And finally, what I would say is that not only are they going through the same processes and practices that haven't worked for them, Ellen, it's what we're asking them to do is not reparative, meaning like there has been a harm. So what do we do that shows up in a greater way, right? In a deeper way that really understands the harm that our society has created and that we're actually repairing yet. So not trying to fix something that's broken, that hasn't worked, but actually recreating, building something that really allows them to be successful. That's what equity to me is about, and community is about actually repairing the harm, recreating, rethinking these systems and practices to build something new versus trying to figure out how you fix something that's been broken and have been underperforming in the long run. That's what I think radical love looks like in community. It's about understanding fully that the people that we are supposed to love and to support, that they have these aspirations, and it's our responsibility to rethink the way that we present solutions. And the cool thing about this is if we represent these solutions and create new systems and strategies and approaches to be able to do this work, what ends up fundamentally happening is that everybody benefits, right? Like, so some people will hear this and say like, oh, well, only those kids will benefit. No, if this works for kids who've had the greatest challenges, then how do you think it's going to work for people who have not had those same challenges? It actually enables them to do things in a different way and gives them opportunities too. That's what radical love to me is about. It's about expanding the solution set that will make sure that everyone succeeds. And it's all driven by aspiration. It's about building for the future. So that's how I kind of think about this issue. And so I know that this is not something new to you. I know in Milwaukee, you and Greater Milwaukee Foundation, you've been doing this work too, and you've been convening people to rethink what it looks like to show up in an equitable way and then with radical love. So I'm curious about you talking a little bit and sharing with us about your convening work.
Well, thank you, Tanya. And what a great start to our conversation. As you can understand now, those of you that have joined us, why we have invited Tanya to have this conversation, because she is so inspirational. I love your focus on radical love and on building systems that help everyone thrive. So our work in Milwaukee is very aligned with your work in Minneapolis and your previous work in Detroit. I would say we have been about convening for many years, but I would say our most recent example is really around our COVID response, where we organized a number of civic response teams in every area of COVID response that included residents, practitioners, people on the front lines. And to your point about really understanding that not only were communities of color hardest hit by COVID, but COVID was not a one-dimensional effort. It wasn't a health effort. It wasn't a health pandemic, economic pandemic, educational pandemic. But the vision of helping people thrive is a vision that our community foundation has long been focused on, and really having a community-centered approach. And I love the idea of wrapping your arms with love around the people who need it most, and making sure that the resources and the supports help people thrive. And that's really where we have our work in common. So let me go to our second conversation topic, which is the success for any effort we're talking about is really following community voice. And I know that all of these themes are related in the sense of they're all interconnected, but let's dig down a little bit in terms of the importance of community voice. If the priorities of those that are affected by our work is centered in our work, then the power of decision-making is shared. Our investments will have, as you said, real impact on people's lives. And you've been leveraging an important engagement project to inform your community development work. Can you tell us about the Lake Street alignment and how does that connect to the Groundbreak Coalition you're helping lead?
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So I would just say I'm a big believer in co-creating. Like, one of in the way that you just talked about the work that you're doing around convening people, convening just for the sake of convening is fun, but it's not always impactful. So part of why we have to convene people is that we're really co-creating, that we're bringing people to the table, and we're listening to their voices, that they get to help set the agenda, not just to participate just to participate in the meeting, that they get to frame the way that we're thinking about issues, talking about issues, and that they get to do it for a long time, right? So oftentimes I often say is like community engagement is not about inviting people to the table and giving them a folding chair. Right. This is really about being equal partners, listening and hearing. And so one of the first things I did when I got to Minneapolis was to go to some of our partners and to ask them about what was needed in the region, particularly after the uprisings that happened after George Floyd's death. And you all know this as well as Minneapolis knows this, that George Floyd's death was the impetus of the uprisings, but it didn't start nor does it end with George Floyd's experience and the murder that happened there. So when I asked about this notion of like, what could we do to make sure that we capture this moment to reimagine and kind of rebuild what we were going to do, what many of our partners in the community said, and who were working on this issue is like, we need to repair, we need to rebuild, we have to reimagine. People had started to establish funds. And they said, look, we're going to work on this repair and we're going to work on rebuild. So why don't you go and think about what it means to reimagine? So our team started to make investments on Lake Street, which was the main corridor in which the uprisings began in Minneapolis. And what we found as we were investing in them, rethinking what does it look like to come out of this experience stronger and better and more purposeful about having rich and strong cultural corridors where businesses of color can thrive, as well as the communities that surround them. What came out of that were really brilliant ideas. And here's the thing about it. They were not ideas that we had never heard before. These were the things that community had been asking for a really long time. They just have been repeating often enough, like, this is the kind of capital we need. This are the types of investments we need. This is the kinds of ways that we need you to show up patiently as we're building and growing this corridor. And so often I think to myself was like, we essentially were setting people up, right? Like, so we asked them the same question over and over again. They tell us what they need, and then we say that's not doable. And so part of what Groundbreak is really about was trying to tackle that question that many of us would have said, like, yeah, capital doesn't flow equitably. It doesn't flow to people of color. Isn't that too bad? Or can we figure out how to get a fund together where we can do a workaround of the system of capital where we can put money into communities of color versus really trying to deal with this issue of like, no, we don't need a fund. What we need is fundamental change. And that's what Groundbreak is really about. It's about pulling together a coalition of people across our region who are committed to rethinking the way capital moves, how it's deployed, how it's absorbed, and making sure that it is moving in a way that is equitable and also builds for the future and ensures that we have some climate resiliency as a region. So like that the people who are getting access to capital and who are building understand that this is for the long game, not just for the short game. And so that climate resiliency has to be built into that. So Groundbreak Coalition is really a group of leaders, about 40 or so leaders growing, and the industries that are represented are financial institutions, corporations that may have long and patient capital. We have philanthropy, we have government at every kind of like jurisdiction level, from the city all the way up to the state. We have nonprofit leaders and developers all at the table thinking about what does it look like for capital to move and shift differently. And what I love about Groundbreak is that it's not a silver bullet, right? Like, this is not about trying to define what community needs. Community ought to do that, right? This effort is really about how do we get the people who deploy capital to use their power. And I often describe power as the ability to rewrite the rules. So we all have power. We can rewrite our rules. What does it look like for us to rewrite the rules so that we can actually fuel the vision of community and make sure that the fuel that's coming, right, like that the solution has to be scaled at the size of the problem? Because half the time when we talk about these issues that we really deeply care about, we're often thinking about very small and incremental ways of addressing that. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for incremental change and moving things as best as we can. But at some point, our aspiration has to be greater so that we can design systems that move things at scale. And so that's what Groundbreak is about. It's about dealing with 4 areas that we all know are important issues in our community, but they're important issues everywhere. I'm sure these are like some of the top priorities for Milwaukee too. It's about making sure that we have entrepreneurs of color and that they're capitalized. And so we have, our goal and ambition is to move about 23, Nope, wrong number. 10,000 new businesses for people of color. We also believe that we need to help make sure that people of color are purchasing homes. And so, what does it take to be able to do that? And so, we have a goal of 45,000 new homeowners in our region that are people of color. We think that we need affordable housing to help people stabilize their homes, their lives, their financing. And we think that we can contribute to about the creation of about 23,000 units if we're really thoughtful and that we're smart about the way that we do this. So it's really about home ownership, commercial development. We believe that there are some very specific projects that we can invest in that are community driven, owned by people of color, and that can anchor and be catalytic up and down Lake Street in the other cultural corridors. So that's what this whole broad coalition is aligning itself to be able to do, which means mostly that we have to hold ourselves accountable to these goals and ambitions, shift the way that we deploy resources so that it actually makes sure that funding is flowing rather than just landing and being distributed one time. And it's about working and being community informed, community engaged, and working with people so that they know that these resources are about helping them to execute their visions versus trying to create a new vision all by ourselves that is unrelated to what community desires and ambitions are, and also the plans that people have been working on for years. So how do we fuel that? So that's what equity, I think, looks like in play. And I think those are the kinds of things we need to do in Minneapolis, especially post George Floyd, and helping people understand, like, yes, that was a moment, but as a region, we don't take that for granted, that we know that this has been integrated systems of, quite honestly, oppression, because, like Milwaukee, we have some of the greatest disparities in our community. So in order for us to address that, we can't be incremental, right? Like, we got to start thinking about how do we take some leaps? How do we scale some of these solutions? And how do we behave fundamentally different? Because that's the only way we're going to be able to move $2 billion of capital over the next 10 years in a different way that helps advance racial equity and also advances us towards a more climate resilient future.
There is so much there that aligns with the work that we're doing in Milwaukee. And I just want to pick up on a couple of themes that you touched on, Tanya. One is, just the basic element of community engagement. I totally agree with you that for far too long, communities have been asked what they need and what they want and what their aspirations are, and it has fallen on deaf ears. So we in Philanthropy have both the opportunity and the obligation to do things differently. And I hope that we are doing things differently in Milwaukee, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. And I just want to share a little bit of what you shared with regard to your work in Minneapolis. It has tremendous parallels to our work. We are working on a vision for a Milwaukee for all that has key elements of an effort to increase housing, early childhood education, economic inclusion, and home ownership. And so the elements that really bring that to life are our Thrive On collaboration, which is a very unique partnership. But to your point of investing in cultural corridors, this is a historic renovation of a 400,000 square foot former Schuster's Gimbel's department store that will be very comprehensive and catalytic on the cultural corridor of Dr. Martin Luther King Drive. It is a partnership between the Medical College of Wisconsin, the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, and Royal Capital. We'll hear from the developer, Kevin Newell, as part of our roundtable discussion. But it is really us using our power and our resources in a very different way. And I would say that the other component of it is really the importance of our partnership with community residents and stakeholders not just in the construction phase, not just in hearing what residents and stakeholders need, but from the very beginning, it was a key element of our work together. We have convened, I would say, hundreds of people from the beginning of the process to hear, to listen, to hear their aspirations, and not only listen, but respond. That is the most important element of listening, is to do differently with what we hear. And so in addition to moving our headquarters, the foundation's headquarters, to Thrive on King is what the project is called. We will have the medical college, will have outwardly facing programs and resources. There'll be up to 90 units of housing, and the first floor will be all community space, including an early childhood care and education center, healthy food, focus on jobs and health services. So it all driven by what the community has said they want. Culturally, we are working on art, both in the building and outside. So we are trying to really demonstrate that as a philanthropic resource in this community and a leader, that we can do things differently. And we will do things differently, including loans to small businesses up and down Martin Luther King Drive, investments in early childhood care and education centers, not only in the building, but in the surrounding neighborhood. So we are really using, I love your phrase of using our power to really do things differently and try and change the systems that have been really, really destructive to many neighborhoods in Milwaukee.
Thanks, Ellen. I really appreciate hearing about the Thrive On collaboration and Thrive On King, because what you're doing is exactly what we should be doing in philanthropy. We have to center lived experience, and we have to have authentic relationships. We have to listen, and we have to hear things that sometimes we used to ignore, and just really reform and reshape the way we show up in those conversations. And that just really creates a new opportunity for us to expand our solution set. And that's the unique role that we have in philanthropy today. And so I'm really grateful to hear about your work in Greater Milwaukee.
Thank you so much, Tanya. And thank you for this wonderful conversation and all the insights you've shared so far. It has really been a wonderful conversation. So now, why don't we expand the table? We have an opportunity now to hear from some local leaders who are moving the needle here in Milwaukee. I'm excited to introduce you to our roundtable participants and have you join in the conversation. And I want to remind everyone, again, to stay online to participate in the talkback session after the roundtable discussion. So now let's welcome our new guests. Kevin Newell is founder and CEO of Royal Capital, a leader in urban development and innovation. Kevin is co-chair of the Thrive On Collaborative discussed earlier. Clintel Hassan is Strategic Initiatives Director and manager of Milwaukee Succeeds, which aims to unite our community around a shared vision of success for every child in every school, cradle to career. And Glenn Carson is Director of the Milwaukee Community Schools Partnership through United Way of Greater Milwaukee and Waukesha County. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd love to have each of you take a moment and just paint a brief picture of your roles. Glenn, could you start by sharing a little bit about community school model?
Yeah, community schools is a collaborative strategy that has been adapted across the country that really works to work with community partners to work around the success of students, and rooted in that is relationships. So here in Milwaukee, we have 16 MPS schools that we work in, and we make up about 10% of the school district. And our core practices are shared leadership, equity, and cultural relevance. Within the work that we do at each of our schools, really use those three practices to really transform how the school functions and how the school works on a day-to-day basis.
Great, thank you. I love the community schools model.
Thank you.
It's cool.
And Clintel, you've been instrumental at Milwaukee Succeeds on the Youth Forward Milwaukee Initiative and Design Your Future Fellowship. Can you explain a little bit about that effort?
Yeah, so back in 2019, Milwaukee Succeeds embarked on a strategic planning process. And during that time, we selected early child care and education and high school success as our two priority areas. For high school success, we knew that it was going to be imperative that we involve youth in our strategies and decision making. And so the Design Your Future Fellowship was our attempt to involve youth in that. We had over 60 diverse young people from across the city of Milwaukee come together for over 6 weeks, telling us their solutions on how they would rethink education to improve outcomes for Black male youth. Those proposals that they've come up with are now in process of implementation and have become our strategies. And in order to make sure that they are implemented and sustainable, we knew that we need to have a coalition to support that work and support the systems change necessary. And so that's what Youth Forward MKE is about. And what's unique about this coalition is youth-led. And so we really wanted to ensure that we have youth-adult equity and that young people are at the table making decisions and feel empowered to really guide and direct the work.
Thank you so much. And of course, that work is near and dear to my heart, so thank you.
Awesome.
And Kevin, how would you describe your approach to real estate development overall, as well as with the development of Thrive on King specifically?
Our favorite project.
Yes,
All right.
indeed.
Well, first, I got to thank you, Ellen, for being such a great partner, and I'm always thrilled we can get together and hang out and have these kind of discussions. You know, what we do at Royal Capital is not unique in any particular way as it relates to traditional real estate development. We're trying to build, infrastructure and so forth. But what does differentiate us is the fact that we try to do it in a comprehensive way. We try to go beyond the four walls. So our business model, from a real estate standpoint, is really, take 80% of what we do and figure out a way that we can focus on these health and equity lifestyle campuses like Thrive on King. Thrive on King, in this case, is an opportunity for us to focus on what we know to be the new innovation, which is collaboration, focusing on ways that we can be a catalyst in bringing folks all together. Like with Thrive on King, bringing a medical college who then focuses on social determinants of health. The Greater Milwaukee Foundation having this ability to laser focus in on the overall racial equity and inclusion model, and then having the force of Royal Capital being able to, bring all the different pieces together that allows us to do the early childhood education, that allows us to do the affordable housing for family and seniors, allows us to bring in a high-performing high school that serves 500 students with the Dr. Howard Fuller Collegiate Academy, which we're all kind of working on. Mm-hmm. So that comprehensive approach to real estate and building community is something that we are laser focused on. And I think that becomes the model that we can share with others in other communities. But as it relates to Milwaukee, I think this is going to be our critical path forward that's going to help us get over some of the trauma. And for us, trauma is just basically stating the problems. When you start talking about thriving, then you have the opportunity to state the problem, then state the solution. So we're thinking that Milwaukee is going to be a benefactor from all this thriving work that we're doing at Thrive on King.
Thank you. So these are all really aspirational and visionary efforts. So can't wait to dig in a little bit more. So let's talk about who leads when it comes to programs and why it matters who leads. What's to gain from shared leadership when those with conventional authority and resources intentionally shift our power to people affected by decisions and systems? Glenn, would you like to start the conversation?
Yeah, I think the main thing that you gain is people see that you value their opinions and their ideas when you're bringing people to the table around shared leadership. Like I said, in community schools, we really try to value shared leadership and relationship building. So at our schools, we really focus on making sure that students and parents and community members are a part of the decision making. Each of our schools have what we call a community school leadership team. And every month it brings all of those different stakeholders to the table to make those decisions on behalf of the school. Even students being a part of, discipline policies, making sure that we aren't making rules for them without their input in mind. Same with parents, making sure that, when we're looking at planning events, we're not doing it at a time that doesn't work for parents, or that, we're not providing, childcare, things like that. So in our community school model, we focus on the whole child. So really making sure that a lot of those barriers that our families face when they step into our school buildings, those barriers don't exist for them. So we really try to also make sure that those resources and partnerships are right there at the school. So we focus on, like I said, childcare for events, or even providing medical and dental screenings at the schools, providing connection to different resources around job opportunities for families, and other resources that our families face on a day-to-day basis, and making sure that those are available right there at our schools.
Mm-hmm. That kind of goes back to the fundamentals. What we learned at Thrive on King early on, we did our 4 to 5 year engagement process, was what you do for me that doesn't include me, you do to me. Mm-hmm. So it kind of goes back to Glenn's point of making sure that you're involving those stakeholders you're looking to serve in that decision-making process. So
yeah, I think and I think a big part of that too is also that follow-up with that. Like, we're not just taking your ideas and then building something and then not letting you know that we use those ideas. So also that follow-up, I think, is important as well with shared leadership.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a hugely important concept. Clintel, do you want to jump in here on the...
Yeah, I think that follow-up piece is so key, because what we hear time and time again from our young people that we work with is that they get surveyed, they get asked for their input, and then either they don't see anything happening, or they're like, what happened with that? And so it's been really great about the Design Your Future Fellowship and our engagement with young people, as we've seen them come back to us to say, so what's the status of the proposals? What other opportunities can I be involved in? And from that, we actually have 3 of our Youth Forward ambassadors that serve as co-leads on the coalition. We're a part of the fellowship. And we've committed now to serving another year on the coalition.
That's fantastic.
And for them as young people, it's empowering to be able to be a part of something and be able to see that their opinions and their contributions are of value. But more importantly, I think they have that experience. It's happening to them now. So whereas I can think of what it was like to be in high school, 15 years ago, they're in it now. And so they know what today is like with social media, the different things that are impacting them on a day-to-day. And so they keep us on our toes, because when we come up with an idea, they can say, that's not really going to fly. Or, have you thought about it this way? And they open up our minds to that process. And I think that just supports so much with collaboration and innovation.
Oh, thank you. And Kevin, do you want to add to that? And I don't want to leave our guest, Tanya, out of the conversation. If you want to jump in here, Tanya, with a comment.
Sure. I was just going to say, I think this whole notion of thinking about community involvement, engagement as a completing the full circle, right? Like, a lot of times we hear people go to community, they survey them, right, they ask for input, which is an extractive behavior, right? But it's never, when do you give that back to community, and when does community get involved and engaged in the decision making, right? So I think one of the things I often am looking for is don't tell me your statistics about how many people you engage. Tell me your statistics about the number of people that were involved in the decision making, right, because that means that we're actually valuing their input, we're valuing their perspective, and that it's integrated in the full work that you're trying to do. And then the last piece I would just offer, as we're thinking about this, is like, where do we get how do we invest in the connective tissue, which is the work that a lot of times we talk about what work we were going to do, but not always how we're going to do it. And I think what I'm so pleased to hear from all of the other panelists is the work, this connective tissue, like investing in that, in these relationships, because that's going to be critical to ensure that we get great outcomes, great execution, great fidelity, and that it's co-owned, and that the solution has durability.
Thank you. And Kevin, I know you'd like to jump in on this community engagement and how we have listened, and not only listen, but listen, and then do what we've been asked to do.
It's so critical for you to come in and not only listen, but you got to come up with some way to present some viable solutions, because if not, you're just really dusting out the problem and showing them the problem, right? And that's what we got to get past. So I think the panelists here and Tanya kind of highlighted the importance of having that follow-up, and then kind of curating some ideas about how we can solve these problems together. So it's critical, for sure.
Thank you. And so Tanya and I talked earlier about the importance of lived experience and centering lived experience. And one thing is clear from this conversation and from what we all know from our work is that there is no place for lip service in this work right now and going forward. In order to make real change, we have to really center lived experience. So how can we learn from the experience to center lived experience in the right way? And what are some of the ways that you've approached following community voice that have brought the most innovative and important ideas to light? Kevin, would you like to start this round?
Yeah, so I think the lived experience is such a critical component about how we approach our work at hand. And I read an article published by Forbes recently, it was a study by McKinsey, where they said over 1,100 companies had committed to about $200 billion of racial equity capital post the George Floyd murder, and over 90% of it is still, undeployed. And that comes back to the fundamentals of having great ideas, but not having a plan. And when George Floyd happened, we had a lot of folks who came about and said, I want to help. I want to be a part of the solution. But the question they would ask of Kevin Newell or other would be, how, right? So we have this, from a macro systemic standpoint, infrastructure side, we have to understand that the how is oftentimes delivered through the folks who have the lived experiences. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand that we have to remove the often common skepticism and suspicion that comes along with folks who have those lived experiences, remove those barriers, remove those gatekeepers from around them, give them the capital, let them deploy the capital, and understand that you're probably going to get the best results by having somebody with that lived experience that understand these solutions better than somebody who just has the relationships up top. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a critical time that we're in right now where a lot of capital is being committed, but we have to center it around the importance of the lived experience folks getting in there and being trusted to make good quality decisions.
Yeah, thank you. And Glenn, jump in here if you'd like.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that are key for us when we involve lived experience is, one, ensuring that we compensate people for their time. So often, especially with our young people, they have a lot of different commitments and things going on, and so everyone else at the table is getting paid to be there, so we want to make sure that they also are getting paid to be there. And then I think ensuring that we create structures to support their involvement, whether that is the development so that they can build their context and scheme around systems. They have the lived experience of being a young person in Milwaukee today. Do they understand how philanthropy is working? Do they understand how school board elections work? But then on the opposite end, the adults who are working with them, providing development for them as well, particularly around adultism, understanding dominant norms and how they operate, and ensuring that you take the time to listen. You actually sit back, don't be so defensive when you're hearing something critical of maybe your own leadership or maybe your own ways of operating, because young people are taking their time to give you the blessing, the gift of that feedback. And so it's really about taking that time to listen and not rewording or reworking what you hear back. I think often, to what you were just saying, Kevin, around just like trusting the process and letting them lead. There's oftentimes, traditionally, when we think about normal hierarchy and positions of power, there's all these different checks and hoops that people have to go through. But when you really trust community and trust that they know what is going to be the best decisions to fix the things that they're directly impacted by, you're going to make things go quicker, and you're going to see that progress happen a lot more quickly as well.
I love that term. I've never heard the term adultism. I'm surprised my adult sons haven't used it on me. Glenn.
Yeah, I think important piece in our work in community schools is also that relationship piece. Again, like I think our parents have the best kind of lived experiences, and they're able to support their students, but also having them at the table, getting them to be able to help make those decisions. I think there's so many barriers around lived experiences that kind of sometimes fall make parents not want to be involved. I think one of the things that we've experienced is like a background check to volunteer in the school, knowing that parents have a past, and sometimes, they aren't able to pass that background check. So now I can't bring my kid to school or volunteer to help in a classroom. So we're also looking at ways to fix those policies and change those policies to make sure that parents have a space in the building, but also that they're able to provide their experiences at the decision making table as well.
These are such important concepts for those of us who are in positions of leadership and power in a philanthropic organization, who may not have the lived experience that is so important to moving our work forward. So I really appreciate this conversation tremendously, and really work on every day being open to hearing different perspectives, because that's what's critically important to move the work forward. So I'd like to shift a little bit to community narratives and the importance of community narratives. And so often communities are impacted by the narratives that are told about them. And they often, we talk about measuring outcomes, which are critically important. But measuring outcomes is only one element of community narrative. So I'd like to just talk about the use of data and the use of stories in really changing the narrative about our work and what's happening in community. So could you talk about how you work differently with data and how you use stories to tell the story of your work differently? Clintel, would you like to start this conversation?
Yeah, I always think, behind the numbers in every statistic, there are people. And so it's important to remember that those people have aspirations, they have experiences that are both positive and negative, and that there's a lot to learn from those experiences. Mm-hmm. And when you actually investigate and interrogate, well, what has your lived experience been around this particular issue? Then you're actually able to connect the dots to understand, so this sector, this system, all of these things are working and playing a role in this challenge that you're facing. And I think earlier we talked about, being radicals, getting at the root. But that's how you get at the root cause of an issue, right? Is actually understanding what are all the roles that individuals and institutions are playing, so that when we talk about transforming systems, we actually know what our role is in that. And it's not perpetuating the status quo by looking at, for even Milwaukee Succeeds, the reason why we say high school success and not high school completion is because when we talk to community and parents, they said, well, what happens after graduation? When we look at the data here in our city, the unemployment rates are still very high for Black males. The college graduation rate is significantly low for all students, less than 12% at the time. Students who graduated high school actually finished and completed college. Mm-hmm. And so for them, it wasn't just about a diploma at the end of high school. It was, so what are the opportunities going to come after? What are we going to do as a community to ensure that we're removing all of these barriers to actual success? And I think those stories are important so that we do know, this is a great experience for a young person. How does that inform curriculum? How does that inform the content that they're learning about in school? How does that inform the ways in which we develop and train educators? What are we going to require of them? How do we do philanthropy? What types of resources we're going to invest in and continue to utilize with different organizations? I think so often it's like the number, and that's what's most important. But really understanding the story behind the number opens up so many doors to being able to know how. How is it that we need to operate differently? What is our approach? How does that need to look differently? And really be able to truly understand that person's story and how they're navigating life, and not just, this one moment in time created this result. No, it's multiple moments in time, multiple generations even in our city, right? And it's until we really understand those narratives and stories that we are better able to adapt and look in the future, as Tanya said earlier.
Yeah, I was thinking as you were talking, that is a really important concept, and it took us back to the discussion that Tanya started us with about her discussion with college presidents and what young people need to not only get through college, but to thrive. And that's what we're really talking about here. So Glenn, would you like to add to that conversation?
Yeah, within our work with community schools, we work in some of the most high need schools in MPS. So a lot of that quantitative data does not look pretty to people. So we really try to make sure that we add that qualitative data as well. So within our approach, we also do what we call community conversations, where we have conversations with students, parents, community partners, staff members, and community residents. Those are all separate conversations. And then we figure out what their concerns and aspirations are for the school and the community. And then we add that conversation data to that qualitative or that quantitative data as well. And from there, we really work to create priorities that the school should focus on for the next 2 years. So a lot of those priorities are a sense of belonging or safety or academic success, family engagement. A lot of that comes from adding that qualitative data in with those demographic data and those survey data as well. So we really try to make sure that we're adding those family, youth, and community voice within that as well.
Yeah, thank you. Tanya, I know you started us off on this conversation, and it really is about the connective tissue and the context in which we're doing this work. So would you like to jump in here with a comment?
I would, thank you. So first, I want to just say, like, a lot of times when we hear the word narrative, we think about story. But part of the power of narrative is that actually narrative gives you the structure of a story. So you begin to fit facts into the story you tell yourself, right? So part of our job is to rethink what the narrative structure is. Like, what are the stories that we tell about young people? Are we telling that young people are struggling, they got all of these barriers, that they're at risk? Or do we say, we got a group of young people who are what I would say at promise, who are desperate for opportunity. And what we have done as a society have not invested in creating these pathways or these investments that actually allow them to thrive. So it's just about the framework in which how we think about it. And part of what I think we often struggle with, particularly when we talk about data, is that we use data to reinforce the story. Right. And we're going to talk about how many kids dropped out of high school, but not the number of kids who actually graduated and thrived and had success, as it was just indicated. We're not going to talk about like the number of businesses that, Black women are starting businesses. They're proliferating businesses across this country. But we don't often talk about that. We don't talk about Black men as being the most patriotic, because they're on average, they're the ones who actually show up and enlist in the armed services. So when you start reshifting the framework of the story and start using the data to inform you, not to define you, then we get to actually having a different way of conversing, understanding, doing, acting, because we're not using an old framework of narrative that is set in deficit and not an asset.
Steve.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That is a perfect summary comment for, I know we could spend the morning together, and I hate to wrap up this conversation, but I think we have actually come to the end of our time together, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in Minneapolis or Detroit or Milwaukee or wherever we could do it. But I really want to thank you, Tanya, for being part of our program, and also Glenn, Clintel, and Kevin for making this such a rich discussion. And I'm hoping that everyone who's listening will continue to have these conversations, who heard something today that they might incorporate into your thinking or your work. And I want to express my appreciation one last time for our wonderful guests. And I want to urge everyone to stay online for the Talkback conversation, where people who are tuning in can talk about how they will move this work forward. And now to take us to our final portion of the program of A Milwaukee for All, I'd like to welcome Paul Jones, who is chair of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation Board. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Ellen. This has been a great program, and I appreciate everyone who participated. On behalf of the Foundation's board, I'd like to thank Tanya, Clintel, Glenn, and Kevin for sharing their time and insights with us. My key takeaway, if I had to choose just one, is that lived experience is essential for designing community solutions. How can we, as a community, effectively support school students without including the voices of youth? How can we add to the vibrancy of a neighborhood without centering the priorities of the residents who live there? The answer is we can't. And part of our unique role as a community foundation is bringing the perspectives of people most affected to the forefront of decision making. We have embraced this practice as essential to advancing racial equity, and we've seen its importance time and time again. While working alongside residents in Milwaukee neighborhoods and supporting violence prevention and healing at the center of our Thrive On collaboration. And we saw even more examples of it today, from Youth Forward Milwaukee, as well as Groundbreak in Minneapolis, St. Paul. This is not only a practice for foundations, however. We all have opportunity and responsibility to apply this value in our work, our volunteerism, and our philanthropy. For example, if you are a donor, join us for foundation events that place voices from community front and center. If you work for a nonprofit, consider establishing an advisory council or other inclusive practices to further integrate the voices of those you serve in decision making. And of course, our Greater Together campaign asks us all to reimagine philanthropy by considering a gift of your treasure, time, talent, or ties. This might mean mentoring someone in your neighborhood or industry, or leveraging your network to connect people to opportunities, or supporting a campaign priority like the Thrive On collaboration that lifts up community voice. As we say, a Milwaukee for all takes all of Milwaukee. Thank you for considering your role in making our region the best, most equitable place it can be. At this time, I invite you to stay online for our talk back session. Just click the button below to be connected to others in our community who want to continue this great conversation. Thank you for sharing your time with us.